Basically, what we have is two armies of approximately equal strength fighting for control of Khartoum and, by extension, for control of Sudan. The leaders have no ideology and no ethnic agenda. The objective is raw power, which in the case of Sudan gives you power over all sorts of economic levers and shelter from accountability. This is not a civil war at this point, but it does risk becoming one, as these two parties will seek inevitably to co-opt the civilian population and, by extension, regional partners. Just to quote the warning of the Sudan's one and only civilian prime minister of the last 35 years, Abdullah Hamdok, just the other day, he did say that if this is not got under control, then we risk at least another Yemen or another Syria. Okay, so just diving a little bit back into history, I'm going to go, you'll be surprised, I'm going to go a long, long way back. Sudan has always been very strategic. One of the most interesting visits I made was a place called Malakal, which is on the Nile, a long way south of Khartoum. And there I saw a building that had the letters EID written on it. And asking my host, this was the Egyptian Irrigation Department. The EID has had a presence in Malakal for 5,000 years. And that is just a reflection of the importance of the Nile and the constancy of the Nile flows to Egypt. So one dimension of the strategic importance of Sudan. Another one, a little bit, I'm sure Major General Fraser is aware of this, that although the common wisdom is that the Canadian military identity really began in World War I, that is not actually so. If you go into the Peace Tower, you will find the Nile engraved on the stonework at the base of the tower, and you will also find that the first recorded Canadian soldiers to have died in action overseas, they are in the book at the top of the tower, and they were Canadians on the Nile. That's another long story we don't have time for, but it's an example of how strategically important Sudan has always been. Now, it's a country that's always had trouble on its peripheries. Most obviously in the south, of course, which seceded after a 22-year-long war, seceded in 2011. The Red Sea Hills to the east, and even more recently, Darfur, which there's a region in the west of Sudan bordering on Chad. Darfur was actually an independent country till 1916. And in about 2002, a rebellion began among the native Fur, who are black Africans. They are Muslim, but they're not Arab. And really a rebellion against the incursions of Arab nomads from the north. Now, the tactic of the strong men in the center in Khartoum of dealing with these rebellions has always been to franchise out the fighting. In other words, in this case, to recruit local mercenaries, local militias, really stir the pot and have them do your fighting for you. And concretely in Darfur, this meant recruiting Arab raiders on the side of the government, arming them and letting them loose on the Fur. The result, as I'm sure you know, was a genocide for which ultimately President Bashir, who orchestrated it, was indicted by the International Criminal Court in 2019 on charges of genocide. Now, these mercenaries, these foot soldiers, these armed mercenaries, became known as the Janjaweed. One translation of that is devils on horseback. Really, they became a force in their own right. And Bashir decided, after having successfully deployed them, really to formalize them into what is now known as the Rapid Support Forces. So the RSF are a uniformed, highly armed, parallel army. And since Darfur, it's been used for a number of purposes. One is to supply mercenaries to Yemen, to the war in Yemen. That has also been a significant source of hard income for the government. Second is to suppress ongoing rebellions in Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile, but also a more subtle purpose of Bashir fostering the RSF was to have a parallel army in case the army turned on him. So really, he was setting booby traps around the country in case anybody tried to depose him. Now, this went wrong in 2019. We had a massive popular uprising sparked, like many of the Arab revolts in the Arab Spring a decade earlier, by economic issues, the price of wheat, the price of fuel. Hundreds of thousands of people on the streets protesting initially economic reasons, and then it turned against the cry became Bashir out. So you now have the army and the RSF. They sit back, take a look at this, and decide the best way to release that pressure is effectively for them both to turn on their former sponsor, and they arrest him, put him into jail. Enormously popular at the time. But the momentum for democracy is such that they are actually forced to share power with civilians, much to their own discontent. So you have a brief period of power sharing in a civilian government, a prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok. Abdallah Hamdok was a world-class economist, but not a great politician. And this power sharing, ultimately the military, these two militaries who were cooperating at this point, could see their levers, their hands being prized off the levers of economic control. They also foresaw democracy coming. They would be relegated to a subsidiary role. So in October 2021, the two armies, the leaders of the two armies, and I will come to the two personalities here. Leader of the RSF is a charismatic Rizagat from Western Sudan, known as Hemechi. Hemechi means Little Mohammed, and the leader of the Sudan Armed Forces, General Burhan. So the two of them get together in October 2021 to depose the civilian element of the government and take power. Okay, so you now have the military in total control, but it's two militaries. They have an uneasy coexistence. There is still pressure to democratize and still pressure to merge the two militaries, because it's crazy, of course, to have two armies in one country. And this is where the falling out between the two generals occurred. Essentially, there was one timetable. The timetable tried to impose by the UN and the Western countries was for a 2-year process of integration. The militaries would be integrated, and overall command would be with, how can I say, the conventional military, the Sudan Armed Forces. Hemechi, the commander of the RSF, saw things quite differently. He wanted a 10-year integration period, and that's code for no integration at all. That's far too long, and for himself to be leader of the armed forces. So you have a falling out over the timetable for integration. And then, as we saw 10 or 12 days ago, exactly who started this fight is not clear. So you now have the two armies fighting for the control of Khartoum, and by extension of the entire country. So that's how we got to where we are. The ramifications, the potential now for civil war, as I said, is considerable, because these two parties will seek to co-opt the civilian population on ethnic grounds, possibly on religious. There is an element of fundamentalism always in the background. Sudan, the supporters of President Bashir, a number were in prison. They have been released in the subsequent chaos. It is not clear whether the Sudan Armed Forces might try to co-opt that element of fundamentalism again on their side. You will also have each side will try to say, well, I'm the one for democracy. I'm the best hope for the future of the country. They will say that very cynically. There's no reason to believe in either of them. And the secondary risk is that they will seek to co-opt their regional sponsors. Traditionally, the Sudan Armed Forces, their major sponsor is Egypt. And on the side of the RSF, his sponsor would be the United Arab Emirates, because the RSF been supplying mercenaries to the UAE. I should say there is a much more remote sponsor. Hemechi has been able to enrich himself by the control of gold mines, and he's been marketing the gold through the Wagner organization and hence indirectly to Russia. So you have these regional sponsors. At the moment, they're kind of sitting on their hands, and my sense is they're waiting to see who is going to get the upper hand. None of them, frankly, are interested in democracy. You just have to look at some of the governments in the neighborhood. What they want is a strong man, another strong man in firm control. So as and when that emerges, I think that is where their money goes. But as I said, Egypt will tend to the SAF, UAE will tend to the Emirates. That is the risk of expansion, which I think is quite considerable.